The ceiling is attached to something called wattle and daub, which is a traditional building technique that is not very often seen in the United States, but in England, in Germany, probably many other countries, to be honest, and now in the United States a little bit as a natural building material. It's a technique of building that's very stable, very durable, and very, very cheap. So what they do is they take branches, thin branches, and they could be almost any kind of branch, but it's best if they are flexible. And it'll depend on how big of a wall you're making. So if you had a timber frame building and you were filling in the timber frame on the walls, you might use some bigger reeds or bigger branches. And so the timber frame would kind of frame everything out just like the ceiling does with beams. And then in between the beams, they put reeds and stakes. So the stakes divide the beams in half, essentially. So you have a beam here and a beam here, and then you put the stakes, and then you run between the two. The stakes are attached into the beams, and there's portions of the ceiling that have been damaged, so you can actually see how this looks. And then you run the reeds back and forth in alternating patterns to create a weave, essentially like a basket weave almost. Although I don't know too much about basket weaving, but that's what it looks like to me. Then you can take clay and sand and water, obviously, and mix those together and press it into that material. And when that's pressed in, whether it be on a ceiling or a wall, and it dries, then it can be plastered either on the inside, and traditionally on the inside it was plastered with a clay plaster, not a lime plaster, because lime was expensive. You had to mine it, you had to kiln it, you had to slake it, and so a lot of process there. But in an area like this, you had plenty of forests. You could basically cut branches off of the trees. Willow trees were used a lot in the UK, and something called hazel. I don't know if that grows around here or not. But they're essentially long branches. Then you just cut the smaller pieces off of them and leave them in. They dry. They put the mud on it. What's interesting about that system is that it is incredibly flexible. Even though it doesn't look flexible, it actually moves very slowly. So when they had a water leak here for an extended period of time, and also some movement in the building, some settling, the ceilings were not damaged because the plaster ceiling was attached to this monolithic clay surface. And that clay surface doesn't really deteriorate. Clay doesn't change its form with water. It gets wet, it gets dry, it gets wet, it gets dry, and it can do that a million times and it will still be clay as long as it dries. So only where it was consistently wet did the plaster actually separated, fell, and was damaged. And then eventually the clay, because there was so much water coming through there, the clay actually ran out of the reeds. The clay keeps the reeds dry so they don't rot. In the UK and probably in Germany too, they have middle age period walls and timber frames that were done in wattle and daub that are still sound, still being used, and they're 700-800 years old. So it's a really inexpensive system because you can basically, with a shovel, collect your materials and a hatchet. You can collect your materials, but it's also very durable. It's slow. It's a slow system. So you put this mud up there, and it has to dry out. And if you've ever seen a whole bunch of clay dry out, it doesn't dry very quickly, and it tends to shrink. So there was a lot of processes, I don't know about this house, and it varies with the kind of clay, but where it will shrink, and then you'll kind of compress the shrinkage cracks, and then it'll shrink some more, and you'll keep on compressing them until finally the clay is completely dry. And at that point, you can dampen it and add a lime-based plaster to it. So you'll see the plaster, then above that, in some damaged areas, you can still see the other materials. In the hallway, you can see where the building has settled a lot, and yet the plaster is still there. In most cases, had this just been plaster and lath, for example, all the keys which is what happens when you push the plaster through like conventional, oak lath or some sort of pine lath. When you push it through, it curls over the top. plaster doesn't actually, lime plaster in particular, doesn't actually stick very well to wood, because wood has a lot of thermal expansion, and plaster does not. It's very stable. So it expands, contracts, and pretty soon they separate from each other. So that little key, the little part where it schmutches over, is what really holds the plaster. So when in your own homes, if you have an old plaster ceiling and you see a crack in the ceiling, where that crack is actually a transfer of the energy from the break of the keys, and now it's following essentially the path of the lath. And you can reattach that lath by essentially gluing it, reattach the plaster by gluing it back up to the lath with like an acrylic adhesive or something like that. Or you can take the plaster down. But ultimately, gravity will take the plaster down if those keys start to break. You know, it may take 20 years, it may take 100 years, but over time, that's what happens to it. In this system, it doesn't really work that way, and that's, I think, why the ceiling, even though it's gone through, the house has gone through many generations and quite a bit of neglect at one point, most of the ceiling is still there. Then the ornament on the ceiling was done with essentially with little knives, little usually metal shaped knives, and sometimes it's cast now, like on a table. You can actually use rubber molds and stuff like that. But a lot of what you'll see here, they're called like thumb knives. So it's like a very slight relief. It's not grand in the sense of like when you think of Baroque, you think kind of a little over the top. It's actually a really very subtle ornament, and but also done with lime plaster, and the lime sticks incredibly well to the clay. So once they had figured out, oh, this is how our ceiling is going to be, and it's also insulating, so it adds some benefit there, and it's very strong. There was an article I was reading recently that this guy who does a lot of wattle and daub in Europe. It was like a preservation article, and he was saying it's actually more durable than a brick building. The timber frame is more durable, and also that because there's lime plaster on the outside and clay on the inside, and there's no oxygen in between those two really, it's also a very fire-resistant material too, which is kind of an interesting idea. But it's harder apparently to break those reeds and to make an opening in that system than it would be to just smash out a couple of bricks and access like an opening. So it's kind of a cool system to take a look at. And my hope is that we're going to get to rebuild some of this in sort of the same manner that it was done originally. The lime is easy to find, and the sand and the clay is the same deal. And there's usually some straw or some sort of like dead material that's in there, not grass, but some sort of straw or hemp fiber or something like that were used in it as well. So